it's so important, I think, to step back and to acknowledge how much many of us have been through over these last few years. I think just to be alive as a human being on the planet right now carries with it a certain tone of activation in the body and the nervous system. And for some of us, we might experience that as a restlessness or an anxiety, a real sort of shakiness. And while for others, it might be more of a numbing or a shutting down or just a way that we feel exhausted, not only physically, but at a deeper sort of soul level, a tiredness that goes beyond just the physical. Do you know what I mean? But in my experience, anyway, so much of this is happening non-verbally, deep in the soma and what we call the somatic unconscious in ways that we're not always aware of at a conscious level. We might just sense that something is off or is sort of out of center. That restlessness, shakiness, apprehensive, uncertainty. And there's a way that we've become used to this sort of arousal, that our centers of gravity have become toned to that or tuned to that, that they're resonating with that, with this subtle sort of anxiety or spin or shutdown or shakiness in our individual bodies and nervous systems, and also in the larger body and nervous system of the collective. I mean, the truth is that something has fallen away that I think we know on some deep level that we'll never be able to return to. It's never going to go back to the way it was. But the exact nature of what's coming next has yet to be given. It's still emerging. It's still finding its way through the birth canal. But there is a certain death. It's like the death of an old dream, the dream of me and my life and the way it was all going to turn out, the way it was all supposed to turn out. And this not knowing really where we're headed, it can generate a deep, primordial sort of shakiness that many of us are experiencing, many people that I speak with, at least from time to time, an instability or an unsteadiness, an ache even in our muscles or our cell tissue and our bellies and our hearts, our throats, something deep in the soul is wanting and needing to emerge as an ally or a guide into the next phase. And so this unsettled feeling is common in periods of liminality and in what we might refer to as transitional space, where we're in between the way things used to be and what's coming next. It's a middle period, what the Tibetans call a bardo, a real felt sense of in-betweenness. And that can feel really groundless. There's no longer any sort of reliable, dependable reference point around which we can organize our experience. And the temptation, of course, is to get out of this in-between state, isn't it? And back into knowing, into clarity, into certainty as quickly as possible. To put everything back together again, which is so human and so understandable. But in the archetypal cycle of death and rebirth, which lies at the very essence of an embodied transformation, We can't skip over the reorganization prematurely. There's a wisdom and there's alchemical gold inside of the falling apart, a certain type of vision and guidance that's in fact found only there, inside the broken pieces. And if we turn from that liminal unknown prematurely before we've marinated and cooked in its transformative waters, we won't be able to perceive that golden nature, or to become a transparent or a translucent vessel in which the totality or spirit can incarnate, it can embody here. Spirit or God or the beloved, however we conceive of that, needs us as a vessel in which it can unfold itself here, to unfold its body and its being, to pour itself out into the world of time and space, which it will do at times through the brokenness in our hearts, through the shatterings in our souls, through the achiness in our bodies, our physical bodies, as well as the more subtle bodies. And I think it's so easy these days to lose touch with that felt experience of connection, of unity, of simple presence and being, with a joy that is causeless and always already here, actually, that's wired into who and what we are, where we're not needing to resolve anything, to accomplish anything, to become someone different, or even someone who's more healed or more transformed or more awakened. It's prior to all of that, especially in our modern frenetic world where it's so easy for our nervous systems to become toned to those collective frequencies of restlessness, of worry, of anxiety and stress. And the understandable conclusion from all of that something is wrong with me. I'm not okay. Something is missing. It's like we wake up in the morning and there it is. Even if there aren't any words, that pre-verbal, non-conceptual, deep felt sense that something's wrong, something's off, something's missing. And of course, this can be really subtle. We might not even be consciously aware of it, but somehow it's there in the background field. It's coloring our perception. Or in the other direction, not so much the experience of anxiety, but more of a shutting down or a numbness, an exhaustion. Again, not only in our physical body, but in our entire being. And the subtle pathways and channels deep in the soma, even our imagination is tired. Our capacity to play in reality and to play with reality has also become exhausted. And there's a way that these experiences, say, of anxiety and shutdown, can become a baseline for many of us, where that psychic center of gravity can come to orient in a subtle or a not so subtle state of arousal. But again, in ways that we aren't always aware of consciously, unless we pause and we slow down and spend some time each day, each night, attuning to our immediate embodied experience, to the aliveness of the feeling body and to its intelligence, to the wisdom of soma, and to the images, feelings, dreams, and visions that it holds, which is not always going to feel all that natural to do. It's likely to, at least at times, feel counterinstinctual, to go against that status quo of speediness, of embodiment, disembodiment, of that entanglement in a certain sort of trance. It can feel at times quite unnatural, actually, to turn back toward ourselves in this way, to re-embody and to open back up into those lost orphans of psyche and soma who have become frozen and crystallized in the time machine of relational wounding and of ancestral, biographical, cultural, and collective trauma of all kinds. But slowly, the invitation anyway is to bring a curiosity and a compassion to yourself and to your experience. And really begin to open to the possibility that there is an intelligence here which is guiding you, which is orchestrating the whole thing. Behind the scenes, something beyond our ordinary personality and conscious knowing. That your feelings, your emotions, your body, your dreams at night, that these are fields of wisdom and intelligence, but in ways that the conceptual mind isn't always able to understand by way of rational process, of that more of that left brain sort of analytical knowing. Or in a moment when you find yourself out of center, which happens to all of us, when that rug has been pulled out from underneath you, when you find that things are all hot and sticky and claustrophobic and you're hooked into some emotional reactivity, caught in a shame spiral or trapped underneath a waterfall of critical thinking, that you can recognize this, that you can pause, that you can turn into and toward yourself and interrupt that momentum, that habitual momentum of disembodiment and trance. That you can meet yourself and your experience in a new way. That you can encode new circuitry and lay down a new pathway. Slowly, one microsecond at a time. And in this, you might start to see how even our most difficult and challenging experiences are in some ways allies of integration and wholeness, emanations of the beloved, of the great friend. And even that which we call a symptom may in fact be the manifestation of a wisdom figure in psyche and soul, come not to harm but to reveal. That these moments of activation are not obstacles on our path, but are the very path itself. And that in response to these difficulties and challenges, the uncertainty and the not knowing, that we don't need to conclude that something has gone wrong and to abandon ourselves, to replay and reenact what likely happened to us as young children in our families of origin, where we had to turn away from our embodied vulnerability, our sensitivities as a way of adapting and staying safe. And instead, with capacities that we just didn't have back then, we can turn toward that little one who is longing for us, who is spinning inside of our hearts, aching to be held, caught in that time machine of attachment and relational wounding. And meet them, finally, laying down a new pathway by which they can find their way home. That we can help them to come out of that frozen, crystallized state and into the warmth of the inner family, resuming their rightful place in that larger ecology of what we are, of being itself. And slowly, over time, in a way that's going to be unique for each of us. I mean, this is a matter of first person primary experience of direct revelation, that those wounds around love can soften, melt away, and we can reconnect with our essential nature and its innate qualities of joy, openness, awe, wonder, and play. And just that simple aliveness of being, and a joy that is causeless. It's not produced. And I think to experience this for ourselves, in a way that doesn't just remain as another concept or something to believe in, it's essential that we take that time each day to really slow down and to rest our nervous systems, to attune to what it is we're feeling and to our immediate, embodied, non-conceptual experience. What our bodies are telling us as storehouses of data and information, the physical body and also a more subtle or inner body, as well as what we might call the imaginal body, the dream body. It does take some effort though, to flow in a different way than the conventional psychic status quo, which has its center of gravity, at least so much of the time, in a certain sort of disembodiment and in the density of the literal, disconnected from the soma, from the feeling body, from the symbolic realm, and from a more right brain way of knowing and being. And it requires that we experiment with and that we familiarize ourselves with the way of not knowing, with the mystery of the empty cup, with that kenosis that the Christian mystics described, where we're emptied out by spirit and then refilled with a luminous substance. Otherwise, there's a way that we can just find ourselves sort of automatically linking or syncing up with the speediness, with the restless, and with that subtle anxiety field of the collective. And so many of us, whether due to unresolved trauma, ruptures and attachment, or any other form really of any unmetabolized, unlived, undigested emotional and somatic experience, we can find ourselves with this primordial sort of felt sense of, I'm not safe, that it's not safe to be myself in some basic way, to really show up here, to step all the way in, to let life in this world and other people to truly matter to me. That I must at all costs protect myself and my embodied vulnerability, even to shut down, to do whatever it takes really to not open myself to that possible re-traumatization that for so many of us is just sort of lurking there in the background. And from the perspective of our early family of origin experience, there's likely a lot of truth and a lot of intelligence to that. That for each of us as open, sensitive human beings, there's a way that we've encoded neural circuitry, which has become organized around a response to some inner danger or threat. That if we aren't actively defending against life, defending against our inner world, that we're going to become overwhelmed, fragmented, we're going to disintegrate. And so one of the most important practices we can do, as a remedy to this trauma-based toning or tuning is to take time each day, throughout the day, in micro moments. Doesn't have to be long periods of time, but just as we wake up, just before we're falling asleep, whenever we remember, to slow down, to take a few deep breaths, to feel our feet on the ground, to sense that subtle aliveness in our hands and our feet, maybe to soften our bellies, to lay our hand on our heart, and just attune to the actual lived state of our body and nervous system exactly as it is right now. To become more and more sensitive and familiar with the unique ways that each of us is pulled out of our center and into a subtle, or for some of us not so subtle, restlessness and shakiness on the one hand, or that collapsed, numbing, shutting down on the other. And to really make contact with that, to feel it in our bodies, to not push it away and to not automatically just go along with it as some sort of ultimate truth, but to befriend it, to really meet it directly with compassion, with kindness, in a way where we're able to slowly begin to write over that earlier circuitry with new pathways of empathy, with presence, with embodied attunement. And to discover and experiment with the most effective and the most compassionate ways to come back into center, which will be unique for each of us. And there's a trust and there's a confidence that can begin to emerge from that. A deep experiential knowing that I can take care of myself in a new way. And open to the beauty and the bittersweet preciousness of this life. That I can play and imagine again. That I can truly be here as I am. And just the basic goodness in that. I mean, many of us feel so much shame and so much judgment, so much aggression around our sensitivities and our wounding, as if the opening of the wound in a moment of activation is clear evidence that we failed, that there's something wrong with us, that we're horribly unspiritual, unevolved, that it's our fault, and that we should just be able to get over it on our own. It's not your fault. It's not evidence that there's something wrong with you, but that you're an open, sensitive, and alive human being, a relational being who is wired to co-regulate with another soothed and soothing nervous system. And that in the face of overwhelming experience, it was intelligent to shut down. In fact, for many of us, it saved our lives, that capacity. And the emotional pain associated, with our unresolved trauma and relational wounding is tragic in and of itself. And let's be honest, it's not easy to transform and to heal. But perhaps what's even more tragic and what's even more painful is that underlying shame and deep sense of aloneness that so many of us feel, which lies at the very root of traumatic organization in the body and the psyche and the nervous system. Like, not only am I being asked to meet these waves of very difficult and seemingly unworkable, unendurable, overwhelming feelings and thoughts, sensations and impulses, but I'm totally alone in all of this. And as relational mammals, we're wired to co-regulate. process, to metabolize, to integrate overwhelming experience in the arms of another. We're not meant to do it all on our own. And it's not an indication that there's something wrong with us if we're not always able to come back into integration and into center on our own. And this shared window of tolerance, this healing relational field, is something that's so missing in our contemporary world, which is really quite tragic. It's the falling away of the tribe, the missing friend, the unavailable ally. And this is one of the reasons why I offer all of these different online groups, as a way to experiment in providing and engaging in this sort of holding environment where together, we can begin to access, to hold, to integrate, to release, to transmute emotional and somatic material that just isn't always possible to do when we're on our own. We need the friend, the ally, the guide. And of course, the nature of what this friend is, what this ally is, what this guide is of the mystery. And it's something that we each need to discover within the fire, really, of our own direct experience. Because it always, at least in my experience, is a bit unexpected. I mean, there's so much that, of course, we can do for one another to help hold and transmute familial, collective, and transgenerational trauma and wounding. We don't have to fix anyone or save them or entice them to take on our favorite metaphysical beliefs and theories and techniques. In the end, it's not even so much about giving them good advice, is it? We're trying to get them out of the state they're in and into some other one, a state that perhaps will make us feel less anxious or less uncomfortable. I think, as we all know, they will feel this subtle agenda, and all it will do is push them further into those states of sympathetic activation, of fight, flight. I'm not okay. It's urgent. I've got to do something. I've got to fix this, to cure this, and quickly. Even with our best intentions, what is often transmitted inside this subtle agenda of fixing is the energy of a certain sort of non-acceptance and aggression, which only generates in the end more anxiety, more repression, more dissociation, more fear. And just being there with others so that they feel felt and understood, and bearing witness to their own innate wisdom as it recalibrates, reorganizes, and emerges. Listening, really listening, not only to the verbal narrative, of course, to what they're saying, but also to the somatic story as well, to the more subtle, less obvious language that's emerging from their heart, from the depths of their soul. And that can take some practice to begin to attune to that. And if we really make a commitment, to our own healing, to our own awakening, to our own transformation, however we conceive of that, there will be times when even our most precious beliefs and realizations, and of course, all of the identities and the spiritual personas that we've accumulated along the way, which have provided so much orientation and meaning for us. But when these lose their meaning, when we can't look to them to provide that solidity and that ground that they once did, and what was so clear only days or weeks or months ago, we can't quite access that There's no longer that familiar reference point around which we can organize our experience. There's no longer that central axis around which we live and move and breathe. Somehow it's been taken to dust, which may in fact be one of the most important tasks of the beloved, of the guide, of the ally, is to turn that into dust. The beliefs and the realizations, the inner and even the outer friends in our lives, our work in the world just isn't able to accompany us into the next phase. We have to bid them farewell, to allow them to move on, and to really to grieve that loss, the loss of me and my life and the way I was so sure it was all going to unfold and turn out. Of course, that aches and that burns. But that ache and that burn, that is the portal, that is the return message, as Rumi would say. And this tending to the grief of all that is one of the real essences of the path of an embodied individuation and healing that goes to the depths, in my experience. It's non-negotiable, we might say, and has its own timeline. It's not so much how can I get around that, in some fantasy of transcendence, but how will we descend into the body temple and provide sanctuary and safe passage in which that grief can be alchemized, felt, and integrated. I mean, it's so easy to conclude in these moments, when that certainty is fallen away, when we can't find our way back to center, no matter how hard we try, when we're hooked into some emotional reactivity that something has gone wrong, that this means that we failed, that we're not okay, that life's not okay, that I've been forgotten, that I've been forsaken, that we've done life wrong, that the aliveness and the connection that I'm so deeply longing for, that it's slipped away forever. That's the familiar groove, isn't it? Deep in the psyche, which many of us have learned in our families of origin, from the culture. And for many of us, it's also that legacy of intergenerational trauma, ancestral trauma, and the passing down of insecure and disorganized attachment narratives, and just as well as the lineages of narcissism and all of the forms of relational wounding that have come to be held in the body and the nervous system and in those right brain subcortical circuits. But in these moments when the figures of the unlived and the unfelt arise within us, the wild orphans of psyche and soma, the invitation that's being offered is to encode that new circuitry, to not just go along with those automatic, habitual conclusions and voices, and for just a moment to experiment with meeting ourselves in a new way, slowly, with compassion, with kindness, with presence, and to open to the possibility that things aren't always as they appear. That even in moments where it can seem like everything is falling apart, that we can be a true friend to ourselves. We can slow down and feel our feet on the earth, our hands resting in our lap, our senses open, our bellies soft, our breathing slow and deep, and we can look around and see what's going on, to see what's happening in our immediate environment. That we can take a few breaths and we can interrupt the momentum of the habitual responses and open to the possibility that the self, capital S, the ally, the guide, the friend, the beloved, is communicating to us, with us, and inviting us into relationship to tend and to take care of ourselves in a new way. One that isn't oriented in those older pathways of self-abandonment, of reenacting the way that our vulnerability, our sensitivity, and our tenderness was met as a young child, but one that's rooted in a compassionate, embodied, ensouled presence. And in order to get our attention, to break through the trance, the density of habitual consciousness, and it is dense, to awaken us from a state of deep sleep, the soul must at times, at least this is my experience, upset and dissolve that psychic status quo, turning inside out the dreams and the fantasies of me and the life that I thought I was living. What it is that's most meaningful to me, most important, most nourishing, most nurturing, most real, most true. And as we deepen in our inquiry, we might start to open to the possibility that this activity of restructuring, this activity of falling apart, that inner and outer reorganization isn't the expression of some great cosmic error or mistake or evidence of our own failure, but that it's evidence of a certain sort of grace. And no, it's not easy to open to this, to begin to see that alchemical solutio, that dissolution, that putrefaction, that alchemical yellowing, that breaking down of what's in the vessel of this body and nervous system, to really truly begin to see that as the activity of intelligence, of wisdom. It is not easy. And of course, all of us, it's so human to prefer our initiatory experiences to come by way of that more soft, more gentle, more nurturing, more nourishing activity, that particular flavor of grace, being held in the arms of the Divine Mother, which we can honor and be grateful for if and when grace arises in that particular form. And in ways that the conscious mind isn't always able to understand, we can also be held by the darkness, which is such a powerful image. There's a certain benevolence in the not knowing, a way that we're being held even in the uncertainty. It's a more wrathful, reorganizing, wild, untamed form of grace, to be sure, but a grace nonetheless. It's a grace that doesn't have the maintaining of the illusion of our control as its aim, but rather our individuation and our wholeness. It's a grace that isn't unbounded, it's undomesticated, it's operating outside of our own hopes and fears. It's not part of that intergenerational matrix of trauma and trance. It's wild and alive and a manifestation of pure spirit as it longs to find its way into this world, incarnating and embodying through us as its vessel. But of course, coming to that direct experience for ourselves isn't easy. It's not really something that's taught or understood or even all that honored in our world, is it? How an embodied, compassionate, tending to the unwanted, to the marginalized, to the orphaned aspects of our experience allows it to be liberated and released. And what appeared to be working against us was only light in disguise. one of the lost pieces of soul who have wandered off course and is now longing to come home. And these wandering pieces of soul, who are held at times in underground storage in the shadow, there with all of the guides and the friends of the underworld, Persephone, Hermes, Sophia, and all of the variety of psychopomps, whose role it is to guide us through liminal and transitional times into and through the in-between places. And so we might imagine that these pieces of soul, though they are often alone and unable to reach us, and we can't quite see them, that they are nonetheless being held and being protected by those non-ego aspects of the psyche, of the archetypal world, Kuan Yin, Guadalupe, white and green Tara, Christ, and of course, other figures and energies that don't fit into any particular religious, mythological, or spiritual tradition. They're held until a time when the inner or outer resources are available, when we're able to meet them again and provide a temple or a sanctuary in which they can return, when those psychic and somatic enzymes of presence, of compassion, of love are able to metabolize and integrate the terror and the pain and the piercing loneliness that all of these figures have been carrying for us on our behalf. But it does take practice. It does take effort. It does take some slowing down and a real commitment and a devotion, a fidelity to our inner lives, to our bodies, to our hearts. And perhaps it also does require some grace, which is always going to be a bit wild and untamed, uncontrollable, and really totally out of our hands. Okay, so I think I'll leave it here for today. And I just want to thank you again for spending some time with me and for sharing some of your heart and your energy here for your being. And I'd love to see you inside the new course where we can make this journey together this fall, and if not, hopefully in some other way, in the weeks and months to come. And I really wish you the best on your own path and in your life. And until we meet again, please take care of yourself, and just sending you lots of love.